Below the Surface. Written by Brandon Mewton. Chapter 1. The Usual. The drink burned going down, a bitter reminder that I was still among the living, at least for another night. I nursed my seventh drink of the evening, the heavy crystal glass slick with condensation in my battered knuckles. Across the worn mahogany bar, Jimmy 2 cups, the bartender gave a suggestive nod, signaling another round was incoming. That's good. My glass was getting dry, and my patience were growing thin. I had just lost a client to his opposition. Something that I've never experienced. Failure was new to me, but it fit like a tailored suit, defining me in this moment. I scanned the crowd out of habit, more than any interest in the people in it. Most faces were familiar, the regulars that kept this place in business night after drunken night. In the far corner booth, Old Man Jones was 3 sheets to the wind already, his whiskey-slurred stories getting louder and more slanderous by the minute. Near the pool tables, the Johnson brothers were trying to start their weekly brawl over imagined slights or past transgressions, puffing out chests and squawking like perturbed chickens. Behind the bar, Jessica flashed her pearly smile and perky tits for the patrons, flirting for bigger tips. Who could blame her? This place is a shit hole, and she's a gutter angel. More power to her, I mused, though her type of transaction left a sour taste in my mouth. On one hand, just like every other brute in this place, I would take her to her bed, ravage her for the night, show her some of my tricks, and learn some of hers. Once upon a time, I might have rushed to defend her honor, back when I still wore a badge and cared about defending anyone's honor. It's like living in the in-between, 2 worlds superimposed over one another. Honor, bravery, that was a lifetime ago, before the corruption sank its teeth in and showed me the true face under the blue mask, one not much different than the degenerates and lowlifes that now surrounded me every night at this bar. Nowadays I fare the same in the devil's playground. Another pawn the true players never see fit to put into play. So I have to make my own way, carve out what's mine at knife point. Back then, I still believed in right and wrong, protecting the weak from the wicked. What a joke. As if any of them were worth saving. I was getting low and needed a refill. I nodded to Jimmy for another, the only consistent thing in my life. My glass was refilled, the ice cubes clinking merrily. He looked like he might ask me something, but Jimmy knew better than to try and chat when I was in a mood like this. Again lost somewhere in the past with a scowl carved deep in my features. I see them reflected in the Bud Light mirror across the bar. It doesn't surprise me. Molly is my only female interaction worth note. I never was good with the girls, riz, game, whatever it is, I don't have it. Never have. I was almost married once, almost. She thought better of it. And even now I can't blame her. I lost my way, she continued on hers. I see her here and there, going to and fro. Tonight I wished for a familiar face, someone who shared my hate for the world. But tonight, drink number 13 beckoned. There were times in my weaker moments that I wondered what life would be like for these other patrons. The salarymen just off work, relaxing with friends or flirting harmlessly with Molly over beers. Ordinary lives with no clue how close we all walk to the edge, and if they only peered over they would see the abyss staring back. I envy them honestly. I can't think of a better word to describe it. I tried to picture coming home each night to a wife's kiss and kids running to greet me, a white picket fence and yard lit by porch light. But that was never in the cards for someone like me. Grown too quickly, too much blood on my hands, no real stability. I forfeited any claim to normalcy or happiness the day I took my first look into what lies beneath, allowing evil to flourish right under my nose. October 12th, 2012. A day I will forever curse. It was just like any other. Aching back and heroic hangover clinging to my mind with iron talons. Easy domestic. First thing in the morning, By afternoon, we were shooing away hookers and trying to clear off the streets. Dispatch crackled to life, the voice on the other end as lifeless as a grey Monday morning. Unit 4-1, we have a possible 10 to 54, reported infant body and 2 others. Address, 1437 West Elm Drive. The voice, detached and clinical, carried the weight of a world gone mad. Vic Rader, my partner for 6 years at the time, responded without missing a beat. Dispatch, this is Unit 4-1, we're en route. His voice was steady, the kind of steady that only comes from years of staring into the eyes of danger and refusing to blink. But even Vic's calm couldn't mask the chill that ran inky in our veins. An infant, God damn it. I felt my stomach churn, a dull ache setting in. We drove in silence, the city passing by in a blur of neon and concrete. The streets were an endless parade of lost souls, each one carrying their own invisible burdens. Some are less invisible than others, but this would be different. When we arrived at 1437 West Elm, the scene was already cordoned off with yellow tape. The house stood like a mausoleum, its windows dark and foreboding, silent as a midnight grave, as cold as one too. I found my breath forming puffs of smoke as I approached in dread. A crowd had gathered, morbid curiosity etched on their faces. We pushed through, flashing our badges like talismans warding off the evil reporters. The front door creaked open, revealing a scene that made my blood run to Arctic streams. The stench hit me first, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the air, thick as molasses. I had smelled death before, but this was different. This was death with a flavor of evil that's hard to describe. Whoever did this was more than out of their fucking mind. They were bloody, maniacal, sinister, pure evil. The living room was a Geiger painting, a nightmarish vision straight out of Clive Barker's worst dreams. 3 bodies lay sprawled on the floor, their limbs contorted in unnatural angles, bent into grotesque symbols of unknown meaning. The infant was the first thing I saw, its tiny body mutilated beyond recognition. My heart clenched in my chest, a visceral reaction to the sheer brutality of it. Its tiny legs had been ripped off and placed on its head like horns of flesh. Vic muttered a curse under his breath, his face pale. Jesus Christ, Dennis, what the fuck happened here? He turned a sickly pale before looking away, gagging. It was the maggots. Vic hated maggots. It was an understandable fear. Some of our worst finds were in their company. Consuming, burrowing, writhing. I forced myself to look closer, my mind struggling to make sense of the carnage. Strange engravings covered the bodies, intricate patterns carved into flesh with a precision that spoke of something more than mere madness. Exacto blade precise incisions. I noted the thoroughness of it all. Symbols I didn't recognize. Symbols that I doubted people up at the university would recognize. Maybe that was for the better. I still see them some nights. Like looking briefly at the sun and closing your eyes, they blaze with otherworldly light. We're dealing with something else here, Vic, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't just a murder. This is some witchcraft shit. These symbols don't read satanic to me, but I know a ritual when I see one. This is above our pay-grade, friend. Vic looked better now, his eyes scanning the room with the keen intensity of a predator. Ritualistic, maybe? Some kind of cult? I shook my head, the pieces of the puzzle refusing to fit together. I don't know. But whatever it is, it goes beyond anything we've ever seen. We moved through the house like shadows, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Each room revealed more horrors, more evidence of a mind unhinged. Blood smeared on the walls, strange symbols drawn in crimson. It was as if the house itself had become a canvas for some deranged artist. In the basement we found the altar, a crude wooden structure, stained with blood and adorned with candles melted to their bases. I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, a suffocating atmosphere that made it hard to breathe. Like a vacuum, as if something was breathing the air out of the space. Vic was silent, his face a mask of confusion and disgust. We had seen death before, but that was something else entirely. Whatever light had been left in me died that day, and I'd never been able to find my way back from the darkness since. The FBI took over and shared little with us. Hell, when all was said and done, the public had more questions than answers, and from there it died. Its remains shuffled through the various blogging YouTubes and true crime TikTok pages, like lost luggage or stolen artifacts. A familiar figure saddled up to the bar, dragging me from my gloomy reverie. Muscles bunched under a worn leather jacket, as Vic Raider signaled Jimmy for a drink of his own. His craggy face wasn't pretty to begin with, and had seen more than its share of violence over the years. As Jimmy set down the pint of stout, Vic inclined his head towards me. "Demore. Good to see some things never change. Getting an early start on your bender tonight? Figured I'd join you." I grunted non-committally. He was used to my taciturnity. Vic took the hint and drank in silence for a few minutes, sizing me up in that annoying way of his. Figuring the silent treatment wouldn't work on Vic, I relented with a sigh. "Speak of the devil and he shall appear. Spit it out, Raider. I know you want something, you wouldn't bother me otherwise. Especially not here. Don't you have a wife to get home to?" A vicious grin split Vic's weathered face. "Always gotta be a dick, Demore." He set down his glass carefully. "Got a job that came across my desk. Thought you might be interested after your last so-called client went and got himself stabbed to death. Not good for business. Nonetheless, this is right up your alley. Something you can't fuck up. I mean shit, it's you we're talking about. Are you gonna get on with it? Or keep wasting my time with your half-ass insults and useless banter? Not to mention your choice in cologne, you smell like an Italian hooker." He took another sip, and another, then threw back the whole glass in one gulp. I frowned, fingering the fresh scabs crisscrossing my knuckles. The bodyguard gig had gone south fast, as they often did these days. It was my fault for thinking some tech dork wasn't in the shit. Boy, was I fucking wrong. I don't know whose Cheerios he shit in. But he was dead within the hour, no sooner than I accepted the contract. Things have a tendency of going to the wolves in this city, and right now I had a feeling I was joining the pack once more. Vic never looked this rough, not since that night. This filled me with unnamed fears and the venomous spark of curiosity that always managed to get its hooks in me. "All right. Give me the details. What have you got for me?" He slid me a manila envelope. "Everything you need is inside. Call me if you're going to take the job." That's all I can say, at least here. Just look through it, and sober, goddammit, this is serious. I can't have you fucking about. This is important. I sighed and pulled the document closer to myself. Giving a tip of my invisible hat as he exited, I had a bad feeling about this. Bad feelings usually mean good jobs, unless I fuck this up too. I finished my drink in one harsh gulp, relishing the burn as always. Sliding unsteadily off my stool, I toss a crumpled bill onto the bar for Jimmy and make my exit, weaving through the drunk and disorderly crowd. The night air is bracing, cutting through the haze in my mind like a rusty blade. I take a moment to lean against the rough brick exterior, breathing deep until the spinning starts to subside. With a grunt, I push off and shove my hands in my pockets, hunching against the cold as I begin the familiar trek home. My steps are unsteady but sure on the route, guided as much by muscle memory as sight in my inebriated state. A few blocks pass in a blur, the sounds and sights dimmed by my perpetual drunken fog. Finally, my crumbling duplex comes into view, a few lights still glowing faintly behind grimy windows. As I climb the rickety wooden stairs, the muffled sounds of my neighbor drift out, wheezing laughter and muttered ravings, the tinny music of a portable radio. Fucking junkie, always twitching and mumbling to himself at all hours like a deranged lunatic. Not that I have room to judge such proclivities. But there's something unnatural about his constant restless energy that sets my teeth on edge. I fumble with my keys at the door, nearly dropping the battered manila envelope Vic thrust upon me earlier. At last the lock gives way, and I stagger inside, flipping the deadbolt behind me. Peeling off my coat, I toss it aside and fall heavily onto the stained couch with a groan. My fingers aren't as deft as usual, but I manage to work the envelope open. Sliding out the contents, I see it's a simple surveillance job. Follow and report on some damsel. I'm too drunk for this shit, I said out loud to nobody in particular. My eyes rolled in their sockets like a wet slot machine. But it was not gold and treasure that filled my sleeping mind. It was my own personal corner of hell, a place I revisit night after night, wishing I could stop myself. It was a place of mildew and decay. It resembled my apartment, only dead. Like maggots fed on its wooden bones and left it on the outskirts of some forgotten space. Like every night I sat on the rotting sofa, counting the tiles on the floor, ignoring the screams, driving away the madness and memories of my abusive stepfather and his lack of sympathy and love for disorder. The morning hangover was something to be expected. This isn't my first rodeo. Nor would it be my last, but before I put my ass in that seat tonight, I need to visit some old friends. I don't know how long it took me to walk to the graveyard, or the distance from the gate to D77. My mind was a post-alcohol fog. I was on autopilot. The grave looked exactly the way I left it, flowerless and dusty. This time I managed to snag a few colorful ones from the garden outside of the hotel. "Frankie, you old dead dog, I brought you some smell goods." I placed the flowers on his grave and took a seat on the stool across from it. "I bet you're rolling over in your grave down there. This world's gone to shit, old friend. If you only saw your place now, you'd be doing the jit. Things are as they always are here. The government is still not making good on their promises, and everybody's even further divided. Not like the good old days, man. What I would give to go back." "Me too," a stranger said, startling me. "Jesus, you can't just sneak up on people like that. That's how you get fucked up." He smiled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I just don't see people in this meadow of bones anymore. I am the caretaker. Edward Munson." He extended a hand. I stood up and shook it, feeling like an asshole for the forward response to his intro. "Dennis, nice to meet you. I didn't know anyone kept this place up. No offense, but it always looks like shit." He didn't bat an eyelash. "No offense taken. I'm not as nimble as I once was. Old age has a tendency of doing that to us." He gestured to the hundreds of stone markers lining the rows and columns between larger mausoleums. "This place is the local spot for some teens around the area. They don't make my job any easier. But you're right, the place looks like shit. I apologize, both for the appearances and for your loss. My condolences." I only took my eyes off the man for the blink of an eye to look over at the grave, in that small space, without me noticing. The creepy old fucker had vanished. Honestly, I didn't stick around after that. I said my goodbyes to Frankie and got on my way. Frankie was the only friend I had outside of the force. He was my neighbor for years before we finally struck up a conversation. After that, we were fast friends. We shared an interest in fishing and NASCAR, and a proclivity for action movies. We both had collections that would rival your local movie store. His face stuck with me for the walk. Short as it was, it seemed longer as I dwelled on the past. Chapter 2. Following the Trail. I trudged wearily from the decrepit graveyard, leaving the strange caretaker to his existence amongst the headstones. The man unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite place, with his sunken eyes and gaunt, malnourished frame. Best to put distance between us, I thought, and where better than my refuge, the bar. Gripping the battered manila envelope in numb fingers, I picked up my pace along the cracked sidewalk. The familiar streets passed by in a blur as my mind replayed that strange encounter. At last the bar came into view, its warm glow a lighthouse calling my ship ashore. Pushing through the door was like crossing some invisible barrier, the muted clamor and smoke within instantly soothing my jangled nerves. I knew my friends Jack Daniels and Jim Beam were waiting for me, but instead of claiming my usual stool, I veered right, seeking seclusion in a corner booth tucked out of view. I moved the salt, pepper, and breakfast jam from the table, giving myself plenty of room to work. Settling in with weary bones, I pulled the file from its hiding place and smoothed the worn pages across the scarred tabletop. Sarah McConley stared back at me from her photograph, doe eyes somehow penetrating even through the grime. This pretty face held secrets that had Vic so curious he would enlist my help out of all people. I squinted, studying every minute detail as though somewhere in the lines and freckles lay answers. Her known addresses were listed, a downtown apartment and weekend cottage on the outskirts of town. A few names followed, friends and acquaintances, but no further details offered as to why any of this mattered. Frustratingly scant, yet it was a starting point. Vic had his reasons, and I knew better than to push the subject. Clearly, if I needed to know more, it would be included in this folder. I couldn't help but to feel like I was preparing for an orgy. Not the cool swinger society kind, more like the bloody mess from a snuff film. Vic was mostly straight with me, but something smelled of shit about this whole thing. My mind acclimated, piecing together strands of speculation as I nursed a fresh tumbler of Jack, arrived courtesy of some barfly hoping to cozy up. But I waved her off brusquely, too absorbed in the shit show that sat before me. What was Sarah's story, and how did it connect to Vic's interests? Only one way to find out. I'd have to follow the trail wherever it led. Draining the last of my drink, I dug out my battered cell and thumbed through to Vic's number. He answered on the second ring, as though waiting expectantly. "I'm taking the job," were the only words passed before ending the call. Then, tucking the phone and files safely away, I signaled for a refill and settled in to plan my next move over leisurely swallows of liquid courage. First stop tomorrow would be the apartment, to get a feel for Sarah's routine and who came calling. As the hours stretched and liquor flowed, I fell into a haze, memorizing every minuscule detail of Sarah's face until it blurred in my whiskey fog. Pretty thing. But was she as innocent as she appeared? Something in those doe eyes hinted at latent complexity, and I was nothing if not intrigued by mysteries begging to be unraveled. Come morning light, the chase would be on. The walk back home was never easy, but tonight my legs were unexpectedly more leaden. Like walking through rotting syrup, bracing myself against the cold gusts of wind. My neighbor was on his stoop, fidgeting and entertaining a small gathering of fellow attics and lot lizards. I ignored them as I passed, hoping they didn't corner me for spare change. They parted to let me through, and no monetary request was offered, only a suspicious round of looks from the group. Inside the worn sofa was as far as I made it before blacking out and falling into dreamless sleep. A few days later, as the rain beat down on the rooftops like a drum solo from hell, I pulled my collar higher, blending into the shadows as I watched her residence. Sarah, just a name on a file, now a fixation in my mind. The game was surveillance, and I was the unseen voyeur. She had a routine, one that became my own. It was a clockwork life that ticked away in predictable patterns. Home, work, home again, no deviations, no cracks in her facade. Day after day, I trailed her. Morning coffee at the same corner cafe, lunch at the same deli, minus a few occasions for Indian food. Evenings spent locked away in her dwelling, curtains drawn tight like she had secrets she didn't want the world to see. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the monotony was soul-crushing. The weekend arrived, bringing with it a change in the script. She packed up her car, heading out of the city. I followed, a shadow in her rearview mirror, careful not to get too close. She made stops along the way, filling up at a gas station, grabbing a greasy burger from a roadside joint, and even stepping into one of those tourist trap stores selling novelty shot glasses and tacky t-shirts. Each stop was a contrast of the normal life she led, a life that seemed so far removed from mine. Finally, she reached her destination, a weekend cottage nestled in the woods, part of some timeshare deal. I left my car behind, taking to the dirt road on foot, each step a calculated move to avoid detection. She had the lead, but I never took my eyes off her tail lights. Her cottage sat in a clearing next to a large pond, a picture of tranquility that had a stale flavor to it all. Like colors were muted here, and the woods fell strangely quiet with her arrival. I watched as she went inside, candlelights flickering to life through the windows. Finding a hidden spot in a thicket of dead branches, I settled in, my eyes never leaving the cabin. The sun soon faded, mosquitoes and gnats turning the air into a battlefield around me. I swatted them away. Rotten fucking bastards, we're hungry tonight. Hours passed. Darkness enveloped the clearing, the silence broken only by the distant call of night things. Then, headlights pierced the night, winding down the trail toward the cabin. A car pulled up, and two figures emerged, a man and a woman. They exchanged hushed words before entering the cottage. From my vantage point, I had a front row seat to the macabre. Candlelight flickered through the windows, casting ominous shadows on the walls, dark silhouettes dancing to the rhythm of the storm. The three of them gathered around a makeshift altar, something grotesque and primal laid out before them. The man drew a knife, its blade catching the candlelight as he began a ritualistic chant. Omni Dorimda was all I could make out, but he repeated it several times, blade held tight about his head. My breath caught in my throat as the knife descended, carving into the flesh of a small animal. Blood pooled, the candlelight dancing in its crimson sheen. The scene was a perverse ballet of darkness and forbidden acts, a glimpse into a world that should have stayed hidden. It was as if I was back in that house again, all those years ago. Whatever feeling that had followed me from there caught up to me now. I stayed in my hiding spot, the horror unfolding before my eyes. This was no ordinary weekend getaway. This was something far more sinister, and as much as I didn't want to, I had to see this through. My heart was racing and the collar of my shirt was drenched in sweat. Yet, I couldn't look away. The wrongness of it all unsettled me. It was my curiosity that held me in place. The chanting continued, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I didn't notice when she shifted out of view. But now it's all I noticed. The rain was relentless, a cold, slanting sheet that wrapped around me, unrelentingly, clinging to my bones with an icy grip. I crouched in the thicket, my heart a metronome of tension, counting the steady beats of time as I waited. An hour slipped away in the darkness, the world around me a blur of muted greys and blacks, shadows dancing in the periphery of my vision. I was a voyeur of sorts. My breath hitched as I peered through the thicket, catching the silhouettes of the man and the woman stepping out into the rain, seemingly unperturbed by the downpour. No blood spattered their clothes, no signs of the grotesque rituals I had anticipated. They moved with a kind of ease that struck me as unsettling, like soulless marionettes guided by unseen hands. Time stretched as they walked back to their car, their figures fading into the shadows cast by the cottage's dim porch light. I could feel the tension in my muscles, the need to act, to follow Sarah. She was my target, my meal ticket. But tonight, the cottage held a deeper significance. My instinct screamed that something unspeakable had transpired within those walls. When her taillights vanished down the dirt trail behind her guests, the quiet swallowed the night. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a sharp clarity, and slipped from my hiding spot. Each step toward the cottage felt like a descent into the belly of madness, an entity that pulsed with secrets and black currents. As I approached the entrance, the door creaked ominously, as if welcoming me. I obliged. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of decay. The buzz of flies assaulted my ears, a cacophony of wings that swirled around me in a dark cloud. I swatted at them, feeling the weight of their presence as I moved deeper into the cottage. My heart thudded in my chest, a staccato drumbeat urging me to turn back, to flee into the safety of the night. But curiosity, that insatiable itch, propelled me forward. The makeshift altar stood in the center of the living room, a grotesque display that was caked in blood. The smell was unbearable. The flies buzzed in excitement. Dimly I imagined them wanting my flesh to join the feast. A small dog lay there, its body mutilated in ways that defied description. The sight twisted my stomach, but I was drawn closer, unable to look away. Hanging from the ceiling were other animals, their remains suspended by twine. Grotesque trophies of a dark ritual that had taken place in this very spot. Blood pooled around the altar, a visceral stain of whatever horrors had unfolded here. I scanned the area, looking for clues, my instincts sharp as they could be in my fearful examination, but there were no recognizable symbols, no signs of satanic worship or the familiar markings of the occult. Just like West Elm. Instead, my gaze fell on the wood surrounding the altar, strange etchings carved into the grain, twisting shapes and lines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own when I looked at them. When I looked away, they were burnt into the edge of my vision. Compelled by an unshakable need to document, I pulled out my notepad, my hands trembling as I sketched the etchings. Each line felt like a thread pulling me further into a web of filth, whispering names meant to remain buried. A chill crept up my spine, a whisper in the back of my mind urging me to stop. This was forbidden knowledge, a path that led to nowhere I wanted to be. I doubt he listened, but I said a silent prayer to the Lord, if this wasn't demonic in nature. It was older, I could sense that. But I continued, driven by an impulse I couldn't understand, my pencil racing across the page. The moment I finished, I felt the weight of the air shift, as if the very walls conspired against me. I shoved my notepad back into my pocket, the fabric of my shirt damp against my skin, and turned to leave. The drive back to town was a silent affair. The radio remained off, the absence of sound amplifying the tempest in my mind. Thoughts swirled like the remnants of a deluge, confusion and dread twisting together in a horrible ballet. As the headlights cut through the darkness of the road, I felt the weight of the night lessen its grip on me. Each passing tree, each flicker of movement in the periphery reminded me I was deep in the shit again. Chapter 3. Dark Reflections. My hands shook as I dialed Vic's number, cigarette dangling precariously from numb lips. He answered after the first ring as expected, waiting on tenterhooks no doubt for my report. I followed the trail, were the only words I managed to rasp before hanging up. Then I was stumbling blindly towards familiar sanctuary, the bar a beacon calling me from this fresh hell. By the time I collapsed onto my usual stool, puddles had formed from melting ice in the untouched glasses littering the bar top. Jimmy knew better than to disturb me in such a state, silently setting another before retreating out of earshot. I don't know how long I lingered there adrift, replaying the horror show seared into my memory on endless loop. Footsteps roused me from the grisly trance, and I looked up blearily to find Vic sliding onto the neighboring stool, His stony expression told me he grasped the gravity of my findings without need for elaboration. "You were right to call me," he stated simply, signaling Jimmy over. "Tell me everything." His gruff command cut through the haze, compelling my fractured mind to assemble shards into something resembling coherence. Haltingly at first, then gaining distressed momentum, I recounted all that had transpired amongst those gnarled woods. The rituals, symbols, offerings to all, too achingly reminiscent of horrors witnessed long ago on that fateful night when our lives first collided with true evil. Vic listened raptly, expression grim yet strangely liberated. When I finished, he let out a ragged exhalation. I knew it had to be connected, felt it in my gut all these years. His gaze met mine, weary but resolute. "Looks like we'll be reopening old wounds, friend." "How did you find Sarah?" I croaked, numb fingers tightening around my drink. He waved off the question. "Long story, and we've darker tales to tell. For now, you're certain it was the same cult we glimpsed all those years ago?" I nodded stiffly. All the trappings were a match. Only difference was My voice cracked, but Vic finished for me. "Animal sacrifices. So they've not yet graduated to human." He sighed, running scarred hands down his face. "Small favors. Means we've time yet to stop their sickness from spreading." I swallowed heavily. "What do you mean, spreading?" Vic leaned in close, breath fogging from his lips in whispery plumes. "These ritualists, they feed on energy, absorbing it from their deeds to empower sinister magic. Killing gets more intense, disturbing. They crave that dark rush like a junkie chasing a fix. If not curbed, there's no limit to the depravity they might sink to for that high." A chill danced along my spine at the clinical yet chilling explanation. What further desecrations might these deviants perpetrate in service of their depraved designs, I dared not imagine. We had to find them, and fast, before their contagion could take further hold. Downing the last of my drink, I crushed out my cigarette and turned to Vic with steely resolve. "We start digging then. You still have contacts who can help uncover names, safe houses, anything that can lead us to the source of this Bebelite." He mirrored my grim determination. "Aye. It's time we finished what we started all those years ago. These monsters won't know what hit them." With that, we rose as one, shrugging on our coats to face the bitter night ahead, and whatever fresh horrors it held in store. But this time, we would be ready, and God help us. Vic stared ahead stoically as we rolled down the empty streets. I knew the memories stirring must have been toxic as hell for him. Dude had a death grip on the steering wheel like he was wrestling demons below the surface. When we pulled up to the rundown house on West Elm, it was pitch black everywhere. Vic killed the engine but didn't move to get out, just lit us each a smoke and passed one over silent. I could tell he needed a sec to gear up before unleashing whatever confession was eating him alive all these years. Finally, he exhaled a cloud and spoke without making eye contact. "Couldn't shake what we saw that night, man. Something got under my skin and drove me crazy trying to make sense of the evil in that place. I remembered staggering home smashed, drowning the shit show in whiskey while Vic soldiered on alone down his personal rabbit hole. I started coming back here over and over, watching for any clue we missed," he continued. "One night some dude just full-on froze dead in his tracks right here, staring at the house like he knew its secrets. I tailed him on instinct, and it led me straight to the cult's lair. I tensed picturing the horrors such a den might hold." Vic sucked deep on his smoke before the story got grimmer. "Busted in solo. Had to see for myself," he said darkly. "And fuck, what I found inside, names, businesses, properties all over town hiding God knows what evil shit. But when I brought the evidence to the bosses," his hands balled into fists, They stormed the place, guns blazing, only to discover some pristine abandoned church like normal. Made me the butt of the joke for even mentioning real depravity under our noses. "So you kept digging on your own?" I stated. He nodded heavily. "Watched files, asked around, built connections over the years, learned they'd initiated new recruits, like some senator's daughter named Sarah." As the pieces came together sickeningly clearly, and he detailed corrupting the girl of the woods and keeping her on a tight leash until recently, I realized where I came in. "Now you know what I know on this long, fucked-up road," Vic growled, cigarette flaring red in the dark. "Problem is, we're still no closer to ending these bastards for good." I crushed out my smoke venomously. "Not for lack of trying, man, but this time we finish it for good this time." He looked troubled. Before he could say anything else, I interrupted. "Look, Vic, we both know why I left the force, and I know better than anybody why you stayed your distance. That night stuck with me. Even in my alcohol-fueled nights, I still saw those bodies. You've done a lot. The fact that you managed to get this far is surprising. If the higher-ups weren't helping you, then they must have been in on it. You've been loyal to the force, and the fact that they didn't take your word for it is troubling. I highly doubt we get anywhere if we take it up to the top. This one is on us, Vic." He sighed. "I know, old friend, but we don't have any big leads. I just know one thing for certain. The last time I stumbled upon one of their dens of sacrifice, they were still in their animal phase and I was a step behind. I know where the second part of the ritual takes place. Now that we know that they're onto that phase, we might be able to head them off." He loosened his grip on the wheel and allowed his arms to fall slack at his sides. "You're not going to like where we have to go," he said, a grim countenance settling over his features. I knew where he meant, and I wasn't in a position to refuse. I remembered the strange caretaker from yesterday, and I knew the cemetery was our next stop. The cemetery gate stood like an entrance to the void. Unlike any other visit before, I felt malevolence permeate from it. The thought of the creepy fucking caretaker sent a cold sense of dread had taken root in my gut. I watched Vic slip from the driver's seat and scan our surroundings intently. Something felt off here, always had if I was honest. Movement in my periphery jolted me from grim thoughts. I nodded towards the shifting shadows, and Vic followed my line of sight, hand drifting casually to the piece at his hip. Without a word, he jerked his chin towards a crooked row of mausoleums half swallowed by encroaching weed growth. I fell in step behind him as we weaved between crumbling graves and monuments, an anthology of lives cut short long ago. Vic stopped before an iron gate shielding a small crypt, rusted hinges coated with layers of verdigris. He slung his duffel from the cruiser and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. "A little breaking and entering, huh?" I said, hoping to break the tension. My failed attempt at humor fell on silence. Short work was made of the ancient lock, and it fell away with a dull clang as the gates swung open grudgingly, like the dying screech of a banshee, reverberating off of the arched roof inside. Within the crypt, something didn't track, where a stone slab or coffin should be. Instead rested a detailed map of the city rendered in aged details, expertly engraved into the faded stone. Strange symbols and markings pointed out locations across its faded topography. Vic met my eye and nodded towards the heavy stone lid. "Lend a hand. My back ain't what it used to be." I didn't protest. I joined him and began to push. The lid was heavier than it seemed to the naked eye. Maybe it was marble or something, I thought to myself, as it moved slowly inch by inch. Finally, we both counted to 3 and put our all into it. Together we heaved aside the slab to reveal depths plunging down into Stygian shadows. Yet far below flickered the telltale glow of open flame. My eyes followed the descent to whatever lay at its terminus, breath misting air in the chill. Vic caught my hesitation and asked in a rasp, You sure about this, man? Once we drop, there may be no coming back up. We've come this far, fuck it, right? And with that we both descended, on a rotting iron ladder one step at a time. 7 or more feet below our feet met purchase on damp soil. The tunnel had been hand-carved. By what hands, who knows? Deep gouges resembling claw marks followed its length. The tunnel stretched out before us, a gaping maw of darkness occasionally interrupted by the flicker of dim light. The air was thick with the scent of rot and lavender, a nauseating blend that clawed at the back of my throat. It smelled like the devil's potpourri. Vic led the way, his footsteps silent and purposeful, always close to the walls. I followed, my senses on high alert, every hair on my body standing at attention. The deeper we ventured, the clearer the light became, until we rounded a bend and saw the walls lined with sporadic braziers, their orange flames licking at the stone. The whispers that had been a faint murmur now grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to slither into my ears. By the time we reached the source, the whispers had turned to screams, screams that were a twisted symphony of pain and ecstasy, indistinguishable from one another. Vic and I pressed ourselves against the wall, peering around the corner. A withered man, completely naked, stood atop a pedestal, his skin pale and translucent under the flickering light. His lack of erection in stark contrast to the orgasmic muscle spasms that spread like waves through his naked flesh. Around him, robed figures formed a circle, their hoods obscuring their faces. Vic pulled me to the side, and we took cover behind a jutting stone, just tall enough to conceal us in our crouched stances. The robed figures moved in unison, their hands reaching beneath their garments to produce gleaming blades. My breath hitched at the sight of the shimmering steel, and I felt Vic tense beside me. There were 8 of them, by my count. 8 figures, each with a blade poised above their abdomen. In a synchronized motion, they plunged the blades into their own stomachs and dragged them upward to their sternums, falling backward in a spray of crimson. But the blood never touched the floor. Instead, it coalesced in the air, forming web-like tendrils that snaked around the room until they converged on the naked figure. Drop by drop, the blood was absorbed into his skin, and with each drop, his eyes darkened, black veins spreading from his pupils until they encompassed his entire head. By the time the last drop was consumed, his body was a network of crisscrossing black veins, throbbing with malignant energy. The figure's eyes snapped open, and he looked directly at our hiding spot. Vic's service revolver was out in an instant, and he fired several shots into the man's body. The bullets seemed to vanish into his flesh, swallowed whole by his skin. The figure spat the bullets to the floor and raised a withered hand. An invisible force seized us, lifting us off our feet and dragging us to the center of the room. I felt my entire body being crushed by an unseen weight, my bones creaking under the pressure. Vic's revolver clattered to the ground, and he reached for the crucifix around his neck. The figure tilted his head like a curious dog, and, with his other hand, used the same unseen force to snatch the crucifix from Vic's grasp. The necklace hovered above his palm before melting by some invisible heat, the droplets of molten metal falling into his palm, sliding off like beads of oil off of a watery surface. The figure's eyes gleamed with malevolent glee as he hurled us to the floor with a burst of energy. We landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Above us, the figure's laughter echoed through the chamber, a demonic cackle that reverberated off the walls and settled deep into my bones. A symphony that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. Vic and I lay sprawled on the cold, hard ground, gasping for breath. The figure loomed above us, a silhouette of pure hatred. The chamber itself seemed to come alive in the wake of the figure's power. Shadows danced and twisted on the walls, taking on grotesque and nightmarish forms. The walls, slick with moisture, began to pulse and writhe as if filled with a million unseen worms. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, something ancient and unfathomable. From the soil beneath us, inhuman hands began to emerge. They were grotesque, malformed things, with too many joints and fingers that clawed at our pant legs and ankles. The sensation was both cold and burning, a paradox of torment. Vic struggled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dennis," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of ungodly sounds that filled the chamber. "We need to get out of here." The figure watched us with a predatory gaze, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. He raised his hand again, and the invisible force tightened around us, squeezing the air from our lungs. I felt my vision blur, the edges of the world darkening as unconsciousness threatened to take me. But Vic wasn't done yet. With a roar of defiance, he lunged at the figure, drawing a knife from his belt. He slashed at the air, and for a moment, the force holding me lessened. "Run, Dennis!" he shouted, his voice a desperate command. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, the hands grasping at my legs, tearing away fabric and skin as I broke free. I could hear Vic's struggle behind me, his grunts of effort, and the figure's guttural laughs blending into a hellish symphony. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath burning in my lungs. The tunnel stretched out before me, an endless maw of darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching out with clawed fingers. The ground beneath me was slick and uneven, and I stumbled more than once, barely catching myself before I fell. Behind me, Vic's screams filled the air, a sound of pure agony that spurred me onward. I had to keep moving. I had to survive. The tunnel twisted and turned, each step taking me further from the chamber of horrors, but never far enough from the nightmare that pursued me. I reached the ladder, the iron rungs cold and slippery under my fingers. I began to climb, my muscles screaming in protest. One of the steps snapped loose, and I nearly lost my footing, my heart leaping into my throat. I glanced down, and my blood ran cold. The figure was there, its maw gaping wide, a void of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light around it. It reached for me, its fingers elongating into grotesque tendrils. With a burst of adrenaline, I threw myself upward, my hands grasping for the next rung. I tumbled into the crypt, my body hitting the stone floor with a painful thud. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The creature's bellow echoed from below, a sound of rage and frustration that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I ran, my legs unsteady but driven by sheer survival instinct. I ran like hell was at my back, because it was. The night air was cold and sharp against my sweat-soaked skin. The creature's roars echoed beneath the earth, my wounds hissing with pain in the open air. I bled from everywhere I could see, and my bones compressed to their joints. My heart thumped so hard, I was sure I felt my vein throbbing in my neck. With all this flooding my senses, it was then that it hit me like a kick to the nuts. Vic was gone. That son of a bitch sacrificed himself. What the fuck was he thinking? What was I to do with this knowledge? Who would believe me? I can hardly believe what I had seen with my own eyes, but the otherworldliness of it clung to me like a second layer of skin. My legs felt like rubber, and I was struggling to pull air into my starving lungs. Exhausted and utterly terrified, I stumbled through the graveyard, the shadows of the tombstones looming like jagged teeth. I didn't stop until I was far from the crypt, my body collapsing against a tree as my legs gave out. I hit the tree hard enough to see stars in my vision, another injury to add to the multitude that mapped my body. The ground beneath me vibrated, and in my increasingly blurred vision, I saw him, the caretaker, still as a tombstone himself, staring at me with an unreadable expression. I willed energy into my body, but it refused my demands. I attempted several more times, but could hardly hold up my own weight. I chanced to look behind to see that the caretaker stood closer, but as still as before. This time his countenance was something I recognized: indifference. This was a cycle of some sort to him. I knew that from the way his expression went to boredom. He approached. I screamed in my mind, but even my voice didn't want to cooperate. My sore fingers clawed into the earth, praying for another inch. In my impotent scramble for safety, I felt it. The cold, steel-like grip of the caretaker as he dragged me back to the crypt in one swift motion. I clawed. I kicked. My struggles were useless. At the throat of the crypt, I was thrown down into the lightless void. I landed hard, the cold, damp earth enveloping me like a shroud. Several bones broke on impact, piercing my flesh and organs alike. My heart raced, each beat echoing in the hollow nothingness around me, but it was drowned out by the sound of something shifting, slithering in towards me. The caretaker loomed above me at the lip of the crypt, his form warped and grotesque. What had once been a naked man down below was now a nightmare made flesh. Limbs sprouted from its face, twisting and writhing with a life of their own, while amorphous eyeballs blinked erratically across its surface, each gaze piercing through time and space, glimpsing into infinitude. Thousands of mouths opened and closed, a cacophony of whispers and hungry growls that filled the chamber with a dreadful symphony. I scrambled backward, fingers clawing at the earth, but it was no use. The creature advanced, its grotesque appendages stretching toward me, eager to consume. I felt a cold dread settle in me as the first of its mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth glistening with a viscous sheen. It was a maw that promised nothing but agony. "Please, no!" I screamed, my voice swallowed by the void, but the creature was indifferent to my pleas. It lunged, and I felt its grip on my essence, like icy teeth cutting deep into my soul, pulling me into its maw. My body convulsed as it engulfed me, a tide of darkness sweeping over every fiber of my being. I could feel my thoughts disintegrating, my memories unraveling like thread pulled from a rotted tapestry. Each moment of my life fading into the abyss. The creature feasted on my terror, relishing the taste of my despair. I was being torn apart, my essence swirling in a whirlpool of agony, forever lost beneath the earth. As my final screams echoed in the empty crypt, I realized I was no longer Dennis. I was a whisper, a shadow, a fragment of what had once been. My being was now a part of the taint below, joining the myriad of souls bound to this cursed place, eternally trapped in a cycle of suffering. The caretaker's indifference was the last thing I felt before I slipped into the eternal darkness, forgotten and consumed.